Good? There I am. I've never been accused of being quiet. Sisters, staff, I thank you all for gathering today. I'm very excited to introduce Sister Marcy, a Mercy sister, to talk with us about all of our losses. The grief and the sadness we all feel every day is just a cloud over us right now. And we recognize that, and Sister Mary Ellen and the superiors recognize that. So we have asked Sister Marcy to come in and just give us a talk, give us a chance. I'm going to have a microphone going around. If you have questions or comments or thoughts, just raise your hand and I'll come to you. And hopefully we'll be able to come together as a community, as Camilla Hall, and slowly start to heal. God bless you all.
Well, good afternoon, everybody. I thought I would kind of come down into the congregation. Feels a little strange up there. So, and anyway, my feeling always is that one among you. I actually do feel that way. I feel like I should belong to the congregation. I've done so much with your sisters, so I'm delighted to be here today. And I want to offer my own condolences. I had no idea the number of deaths you've had in the last, month or so. And just, that's overwhelming. Like we probably, as Sisters of Mercy, we would have equally as many, not a day goes by actually, but I'm talking about 2,000 of us across the country, the Philippines, South America. Many of those people, I don't know. And so, we say a prayer for them, but that's about the size of it. You know one another so well that it has to seep in a very, very difficult way. So I've been praying for you. I live with another sister, and the both of us pray for you, have been praying for you every day. We've also been praying for your delegates and for the work of the Spirit in your midst. We just finished a chapter in April, so the Spirit has been busy. We're getting our money's worth out of her. So anyway, just to let you know that I'm happy to be here. I hope whatever I have to say can be helpful. What I'm going to do is a little bit of input in the beginning, and then I'm just going to open it up to you. And I will ask you, did anything I say resonate with you? Or you can say, oh, Marcy, that didn't make any sense at all. But that's perfectly all right. I'm not immune to that, believe me. So then I'll open it to you. But I hope that maybe some of what I can offer is helpful in terms of what you're going through and how you can process that. And I'm happy to see that this is a very Catholic organization because at least 2/3 of the congregation is in the back of the church. So I'm happy to see that it's totally Catholic. That's good. That's a good beginning. So I'm going to begin with something that I'm actually working on for more than my own community, but I have been working on this. Last All Souls Day, I was at church, and all of a sudden, the reading was from the Book of Wisdom, and it's Wisdom chapter 3, verse 9. And what it says is that we should be darting about like sparks through stubble. Now, this is a reading that's done practically at every funeral mass. So, it goes right over my head, I heard that before, and so on. All of a sudden, this leapt off the page to me. And what it said to me was, in all of these times, both in the losses that you've experienced among your own sisters, but also the losses that we have experienced as religious, as Catholics, as people here in the United States, as world citizens, we have lost a great deal, especially over the last 4 years. And so I was struck by that when this line literally leapt off the page. And so I'm encouraging you to think about that periodically, especially when you think about us in religious community. What can we do to be the sparks for one another? Just a spark. If you've ever, sparks, well, first of all, you know this, that sparks have the potential to ignite. So now I don't think you have this here at Camilla, but you may have been fortunate enough to live in a local community somewhere along the way where you had a fireplace. I've actually lived in 2 where we had wood-burning fireplaces, and I live in one now. And I really love it when the other sister goes to bed, and I'm left by myself in the community room with the fire going, watching the fire go down and thinking, oh, it's over, I can get up and go to bed or whatever, and then a spark will ignite and the fire will start up all over again, or it'll start up in a different, part of the pile of wood that's left. And we have that potential among one another to ignite. And so I'm encouraging you to do that. We have the responsibility to tend the fires. The sister I live with, she doesn't even notice that the fire's lit, much less would she know how to keep it going. But I grew up in a house where we had a fireplace. My dad, when he didn't want to answer a question, he would get busy about the fireplace. Dad, can I go? And he'd be busy about the fireplace. So I have a little bit of knowledge of how to tend a fire, but that's what we're responsible for. Tending the fire in ourselves and tending the fire in one another. So I'm encouraging you, go back, and that might be just simple presence. It doesn't have to be a great big deal. Just simple presence will help to reignite or to tend the fire in yourself or in someone else here at Camilla. So I'm just encouraging you to do that. And to go back and read Wisdom 3, verse 9. That's your homework. So let's talk a little bit about understanding the grieving process. We've all grieved over our lifetimes, of course. But sometimes we grieve and we don't understand the process. We just grieve. We don't really understand necessarily how it happens, why it happens, when it happens, all those things. So grief is a natural response to loss. And of course, it's an emotional suffering that we feel when something or someone whom we love is taken away. And we can grieve. I do a lot of talks on aging. So in all of our congregations, in myself, I can grieve over my own aging process. So that's a loss, and I have to pay attention to that, and I have to pay attention to how I need to care for myself. I can grieve over small things, that are relatively insignificant, but they're not insignificant to me. And then I can grieve over much bigger things, like the loss of someone whom I love. So there are all different levels of grief. The more significant the loss, the more intense the grief. So the more you knew someone, a member of the congregation who has died within the last month or so, or before that even, the more deeply you knew that person, the more significant the grief for you. And then even if you didn't know the person well, maybe you never had been assigned to a mission with the person, or you didn't know the person until you got here, nevertheless, you got to know her once you did get here. It might have been more in passing, but nevertheless, you came to appreciate one another. So the more significant the loss, the more intense the grief. And as I said, there can be all different kinds of grief, and grief over different matters, but I'm talking particularly about the grief of someone whom we knew and loved. However, even subtle losses can lead to grief. And those subtle losses, if we haven't paid attention to them over a lifetime, they kind of congregate in our subconscious, and so they also affect how we grieve in the present moment. So the way we did or did not grieve in the past can affect how we grieve in the present moment. And I think particularly of a sister I lived with years ago, and her dad died, and she was very, very close to her father. He had cancer, so it was a long, drawn-out death process. Anyway, he died in June, in the beginning of June, and she had signed up to go to a summer program for special education. As some of you know, I was in special education for the whole first half of my life. She didn't want to go. Now, he had died and was buried, but she just didn't want to go. And the sisters with whom we lived, particularly the superior and maybe the counselors in the house, wasn't a big house, maybe 8 people, they kept pushing and pushing and pushing that she should go. It would be good for her to get a change of scenery and blah, blah, blah. I didn't know anything about anything at that point in time. Knew no psychology, knew nothing really about grieving, but something in me said, I don't think this is a good idea. I don't think this is a good idea. But she caved and she went, and it was a big mistake because she never got to grieve with the other members of her family. She didn't get to grieve with those of us in the local community who knew her dad and loved her dad. It was a big mistake. And so, and it affected her really for the rest of her life. So we have to be careful of grieving over things that, you know, it may not mean anything to the sister next to you, but meant something to you. Now, obviously, the death of your father would be a big grief, but we have to be careful to pay attention to those griefs that are not maybe as big as some of the grief that you've been through in the past month or so. Grieving is a personal and highly individual experience. No 2 people grieve the same way. So that's something that you have to pay attention to. Whatever way you grieve or however you feel the loss is the way you feel it. And it's okay. It's perfectly okay. It may not be the way other people in the community grieve over the same losses. That's all right, because no 2 people grieve in the same way. And how you grieve depends on many factors, including your personality, your coping style, your life experience, your faith, of course, the nature of the loss, even your ethnic background has something to do with the way you grieve. And so, you know, some ethnic backgrounds are very stalwart around the way they grieve, and others are just all over the place. You know, everybody, everywhere knows that the person is grieving. And so it's important to give yourself permission to grieve in the way you feel comfortable grieving. The process takes time. We had a sister in our community who was very, very stalwart. I mean, you never got any emotion from her whatsoever. And she, as one of the other sisters I lived with said, she walked around like she had just swallowed a lemon. And you really didn't get much by way of emotion. Well, anyway, her brother died. And her brother, she was very, very close to her brother. The family was all in finance. She was our finance director, did a fabulous, fabulous job. But everyone knew this brother because he would be in and out and, you know, of course, knew how close she was to him. So someone asked her maybe a day or two after the brother, not a day or two, maybe a week or two after the brother had died, "How are you doing?" And she said, I gave myself 20 minutes to grieve and I'm finished. Well, you know, if 2 and 2 makes 4, it makes 4. So you give yourself 20 minutes. If you're a finance person, you give yourself that 20 minutes, that's it. So that was her way of grieving. And if people kept trying to pester her into grieving the way I might grieve, that wouldn't have worked. I don't think people pestered her at all about anything. But anyway, so it can't be forced and it can't be hurried. And there's no normal timetable for grieving. You can't force it. You just have to let it roll over periodically. And I think that is what happens. It rolls over periodically. You don't, I always say to people, it's not Christmas and Easter. Sometimes it's not even Mother's Day or Father's Day that really gets you down, because somehow in our psyche, we get ourselves ready for those days so we can manage them. It's the Wednesday morning when you smell the bacon cooking and you think about your dad or your mom making bacon and eggs on a Sunday morning, and it just overwhelms you. So the timetable is different for every person, and some people it takes weeks, months, years, and for others it happens more quickly. So whatever your grief experience is, it's important to be patient with yourself and to allow the process to unfold as it goes along. Now, you all know about Elizabeth Kubler-Ross and her 5 stages of grief. And she developed these 5 stages: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, acceptance. And there's a psychologist named Kessler, who worked with her, who actually has added a 6th to that, which is meaning. So how do we give meaning to our grief? Now, this might surprise you, but some people don't ever go through Kubler-Ross's stages. They just don't. They manage their grief very, very well, but they don't go through her stages. So unfortunately, when she came out with this theory, everybody in the mental health field anyway, thought that, you had to follow this process, and that it would go like this, that it was very linear. First you'd be denying, then you'd be angry, then you'd be bargaining, and so on. Not so. People who do go through her 6 stages now, oftentimes don't go through them in that order. So that's okay. Or they skip a stage. Or, as I said before, they don't grieve in that way at all. It's okay, as long as you're paying attention to what's going on inside yourself about the whole grieving process. If you are experiencing emotions following a loss, it might help to know that your reaction is natural, and it will heal in time as long as you allow it to. And that's big. Hanging on to our grief doesn't help. It's not going to bring the person back. So hanging on to it isn't helpful, but working through the process and paying attention to what's going on inside yourself is very helpful. I worked at St. Catherine Day School for children with learning differences for almost 30 years. And we had a parent there who had a child who had Down syndrome. And oftentimes kids with Down syndrome have like a hole in their heart. That's actually what they called it. And they would have to have surgery in order to suture the hole. And it was a dangerous enough surgery, as you can imagine. It was a fairly normal one. So people didn't get too excited about it or too worried about it. Anyway, her daughter went in to have the surgery, and she died on the table. That woman went to the cemetery every single day till the day she died, which was about 35 years later. She lived in Holy Spirit Parish in South Philadelphia, and the cemetery was Holy Cross in Yaden. She went every single day. She could not let the child go. She had other children. Other daughters actually, who were older than this child and who moved on with their lives and were very attentive to their mom. She hung on to the grief. So we have to be careful about that. Why she hung on to the grief, I don't know. I mean, she took wonderful, wonderful care of this child. So it wasn't a matter of guilt, but she hung on to it for some reason. And so we need to be very careful to let it go. And I think with God's grace, we can let it go. We can let the person go. So it's important that we take the time to grieve and that we do it in our own way, but we don't hang on to the grief, forever and ever, so to speak. The responses to loss that Kubler-Ross put forward, and then Kessler, are responses that many people have, but there's not a typical response to loss. Because there is no typical loss. Everybody experiences a loss, whether it's a parent, a close friend, a member of the community. Everybody in this room experiences that loss differently. So there's no typical loss, and there isn't a typical response. So what might some symptoms of grief be? Remember I said sometimes we just go through the grieving process and we don't pay a whole lot of attention to what's going on. So what are some symptoms? Well, the first is shock and disbelief. Now, I understand that a man who was very, very close to you here and has a sister in the community died unexpectedly. I mean, he had been ill, but unexpectedly. So around that kind of a death, there can be shock or disbelief. Why? Why did this happen? Or somebody very young, Mary D. Ellis, 5, 6 years ago, I only knew Mary D. from formation meetings because I had been a formation minister. I'd have to say that I was more affected by her death than I was by many sisters in my own community. Shock and disbelief. And, I often think of her, I often think of her parents. I can tell you what her mother had on at the funeral. That's how much the attachment was for me. Nothing compared to those of you in the community, but shock and disbelief. Of course, sadness. Profound sadness is probably the most universally experienced symptom of grief. You can have feelings of emptiness. You can have feelings of despair. You can have feelings of yearning or deep loneliness, one less person at the table. You may also cry a lot. You may feel emotionally unstable. You may think, I'm going to burst into tears at any moment, when ordinarily that wouldn't be the way you would be. And that, when you have those kinds of responses, it can be frightening. But all of those things are typical responses to the grieving process. Guilt. You may feel regret or guilt. Why wasn't I more attentive to that person? Or why didn't I seek that person out? Or, why wasn't I more pleasant to her? This probably doesn't happen in your community, but the Sisters of Mercy, sometimes we can be pretty with each other. So, I could feel guilty because I was kind of to so-and-so. And guilt is the greatest Irish export. I'm 100% Irish. Guilt is the greatest Irish export. And I'm sure many of you are also 100% Irish. So you can feel guilt about those things. You can also feel guilt. This is probably not so common among yourselves with the other sisters, but it could be, family related. If you had someone in the family from whom you were estranged, or, the person was estranged from maybe the whole family, feeling guilt about, oh my goodness, what went down there? What could we have done? What did we not do? Blah, 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 blah. You can even feel guilty about not preventing the death. Now you're probably thinking, oh, Marcy, really, I'm not that crazy. But sometimes we think, well, maybe if I had prayed harder, or maybe if I had visited more often, or maybe if I had noticed a while ago. You can live with people and not necessarily notice what's going on with them physically, and you're thinking, gosh, maybe if I had noticed earlier, it wouldn't have gotten ahead of her. So all of those things can come into guilt. You might feel anger. I can imagine why you might feel anger right now. This is a tremendous amount of death here at Camilla and for the entire community in a very short amount of time. I mean, unfortunately, we expected it, if you will, during COVID, But when Mary Ellen called me and asked me if I would come over, I said to her, do you have an outbreak of COVID at Camilla? Is that the problem? She said, no. You know, all different reasons, and of course, all different people. So we can be anger, you know, how long, oh Lord, how long? Why does this keep happening? So we can feel angry, we can feel resentful, we can be angry with ourselves, with God, with whomever. Sometimes we may feel the need to blame someone for this injustice, as we might look at it, that's happening here in your midst. And so that's what the anger is. You're looking for somebody to blame for all of this. Fear. A significant loss can trigger a host of worries or fears. You may feel anxious, you may feel helpless, you may feel insecure, you may even have panic attacks. I mean, who is it going to be next? Is it I, Lord? I mean, I'm fairly certain if I took a poll in this room, you might be saying, especially where the deaths were unexpected, a worry about your own mortality, and I'll get to that in a minute. So, but all of that is very normal. If I don't do anything else this afternoon, I want to normalize whatever the feelings are that you're having. Physical symptoms. You might have physical symptoms. Grief can seep into us in such a way that we're all of one piece, mind, body, spirit. So you may have some physical symptoms around the feelings of grief and loss that you're having at this particular point in time. Fatigue, I just want to go to bed. I don't want to get up. I just want to go to bed. Or nausea, or lowered immunity. Some of you may be feeling not so well at this point in time. Weight loss or weight gain, aches, pains, or maybe even insomnia. So all of those are physical symptoms, but they're normal symptoms, but they're symptoms that you need to express to somebody else. You know, you need to let someone know, you know what, I'm not sleeping at night. How can I manage this? What can I do? So how do we cope with it? So I'm going to give you some tips. The first way to cope with it is through support. And we're all called to be that spark for one another. So you've got built-in support right here, as well as you have built-in support for the rest of the community. And you certainly have built-in support with your own leadership. I wouldn't be here if you didn't. So seeking that support is important, and taking advantage of it while you have it. So I would say talking to one another about how you're feeling. I think sometimes we think we shouldn't do that because just because I'm feeling low, I don't want to talk to Sister so-and-so about it because I don't want her to feel badly. I don't want to burden her with this, blah, 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 blah. No, talk to Sister so-and-so because you know what? That helps her to know she's not a voice crying in the wilderness, and neither are you. So have the conversations. You know, just go into the community room and sit down and say, I've had a really tough day today. I am feeling so low and so drained. I just can't imagine going to one more funeral. It's okay. Sit down and share that with the other people in the room. That's the support. Get the support from them, and also that support indicates itself in a way it normalizes whatever you are feeling. It will normalize it, I promise you. So even if you're not comfortable talking about your feelings under normal circumstances, it's important to express them when you're grieving. It's very important. Sharing your loss makes the burden of grief easier to carry. So back to the sister I told you about that went off to a summer school program, there was no one to share that grief with. Nobody at this program knew anything about her dad or really knew anything about her. So sharing it, getting it out there, lessens the grief. It cuts it in half. It makes it easier to carry. Wherever the support comes from, accept it and do not grieve alone. Even though there's some, I don't know, 60 of you in this room, some of you may be grieving alone because you're not sharing what you're feeling. So it's important not to grieve alone. Turn to friends and to family members. Turn to sisters in the community who aren't living here at Camilla, as well as the people who are living here at Camilla. So turn to those people, giving somebody a call and saying, I just need to talk to somebody. I've just not been myself today. And I think it's because I'm feeling the loss of so many sisters in our midst. So turn to other people and accept whatever assistance they might offer. Sometimes we think, oh, I shouldn't do that. I shouldn't ask for assistance. Yes, you should. So being willing to do that. Oftentimes people want to help, but they don't know how. So tell them what you need. Whether it's a shoulder to cry on or a visit down to, I don't know where it is. I think it's down on Lancaster Avenue, the hangout for getting good ice cream. A nice ice cream cone. Express, what's it called, sister? Handles. Handles. I'll remember that when I leave here. Okay. But expressing that, saying, I just need to get out for a day. That's all. That's okay. It's perfectly all right. Of course, following our own religious tradition. I have a friend in the community who always says she thinks if we're trying to encourage somebody to enter the community, we should invite them to come to one of our funerals. Well, the first time she said it to me, I thought, oh my God, this is very Irish. Invite them to one of our funerals. But it's absolutely the truth that we walk with one another as all the way out to the cemetery. That's important for somebody who's thinking about religious life to know that we are there for each other to the very, very end. So drawing comfort from our funeral liturgies, and I mean, I've been to some of your funerals. I know how rich they are. That's so important. So drawing comfort there is really something to grasp onto. Meditating, spending maybe some extra time in chapel, just to say, dear God, please help me to cope with this. Help me to know what to do for myself and for, the sister next to me. So spending extra time in prayer. Join a support group, and I would encourage you maybe to have some support groups right here in the house, where people can, certainly you don't have to, but who would like to gather together tonight just to talk about how you're feeling? That's really what the support is about. Being able to support one another around how you are feeling at this time, and whatever you are feeling is all right. There's no bad feelings around this. Anything you're feeling is all right. So if in the house, or if even spontaneously, 3 or 4 of you say, would anybody mind if we meet every Monday night for a while just to talk about this? It's hard to talk about this in a group this large, of course. But in a smaller group, it's not so hard. So not being reticent to talk to other people about what you are feeling around the losses, how you are grieving, what's working for you. That might help. And then finally, talking to a therapist or a grief counselor. There is a certain amount of time that's appropriate for the grieving process. But if 5 years from now, you're still grieving about the same thing to the same extent, that's not healthy. That's not appropriate. And grief can, as I'm sure you know, grief can very quickly descend into depression. And so that's not something that you want to see happen. So seeking professional help, if you think it's a good idea, asking maybe for some professional help here at Camilla. That, somebody can come in and just, like I'm here today, and see people maybe one-on-one or in a small group, like how is it going? How's it going? How are you feeling? That's important. The third tip 2, is to take care of yourself. Be sure you're taking care of yourself. When you're grieving, it's more important than ever to take good care of yourself. So the stress of a major loss can deplete your energy and your emotional reserve. So looking after your physical and your emotional needs will help you to get through this difficult time. And it's okay to look for escapes from some of that. I don't know if you've had, you show movies here in the house, or do you have Netflix, or how's that work? Okay. If you haven't seen 80 for Brady, get it, because it is hysterical. I watched it on a plane coming home from, I don't know where I was, California. I was laughing out loud. It's a good, now I wasn't grieving at the time. I was just tired and couldn't wait to get home. But something like that, a lightsome movie is it's okay to do something lightsome. Sometimes we think, I'm grieving, I'm not supposed to do that. That's not a good idea. No, it is a good idea. So being good to yourself in that regard is very, very important. Face your feelings. Face them head on. You can try to suppress your grief, but you can't avoid it forever. You can try to suppress it and say, no, I'm a bigger person than this, and I'm going to hand this over to God, and that's the end of it, and I'll give myself 20 minutes to grieve, and then that's going to be it. It doesn't work. It comes out sideways. And the sister I was telling you about, it came out sideways. So be careful to face your feelings and to acknowledge the pain. Trying to avoid feelings of sadness and loss only prolongs the grieving process. So face it. And it can lead to such complications as depression, anxiety, substance abuse like self-medicating, and health problems. So face your feelings, express them, acknowledge them, and accept them. Express your feelings in a creative, tangible way. Whether that's writing in a journal, getting them out that way. If you're in any way artistically inclined, maybe watercolors, the colored pencils that people do mandalas with. Like, being creative can help your mind to cope with the feelings that you're having. So do that. Tangible, creative ways. Of course, looking after your physical health. Eating healthily, eating enough, not eating too much, and certainly not avoiding eating at all. Those are physical things that are very important to keep up. So looking after your physical health is very important. Don't let anyone tell you how to feel. Sometimes very glibly we can say to somebody, oh, don't feel like that. You don't have to feel like that. Yes, you do. It's you. You have to feel like that. So don't let anyone tell you how to feel, and don't tell yourself how to feel. Ooh, I shouldn't be feeling like this. A good sister doesn't feel like this. A good sister doesn't get angry with God for taking all these people to heaven. Yes, she does. God is big. God can handle it. So acknowledge the feelings and then express them. And don't let anybody tell you how you should feel. And then plan ahead for grief triggers. As I said before, I'd say to people, Christmas, Easter, Mother's Day, Father's Day, you might have a twinge, but usually I think somehow or other, unconsciously, we get ourselves ready for those big days. But how about the smaller days when you would have gathered? How about the 4th of July? I'm assuming you have some kind of a barbecue here. Okay, so these sisters aren't going to be here. That might catch you very unawares. You might think of, okay, it's the 4th of July, we're going to have a barbecue. Big deal, we always have a barbecue on the 4th of July. And all of a sudden you notice somebody's not there. That can be a trigger. So just allowing yourself to pay attention to what the triggers are. An empty seat at table, an empty place in the chapel here, whatever it might be. So plan ahead for those. As I said, it's when grief doesn't go away over a long period of time, then you have to pay some attention to that. And so that's important. Now, a month, I'm sorry to tell you, but a month, 6 weeks is not a long period of time. And just when you might think you're getting over it, someone else dies. And so that reinforces that feeling of grief. So give yourself the time that you need in order to get beyond the grieving process. I want to say something about complicated grief. And complicated grief, if the pain and the loss is so constant and severe that it keeps you from resuming your life, whatever you normally do, it keeps you from resuming your life, you may be suffering from what's called complicated grief. And complicated grief is like being stuck in an intense state of mourning, not being able to get beyond it, that you're having a difficulty accepting the death long after it's occurred, or you're so preoccupied with the person who died that it disrupts your daily routine and undermines your other relationships. And sometimes we feel guilty when we do get beyond grief. You know, I mean, we feel like, oh, I should care about her more because I shouldn't be beyond this. That's insane. That's not the truth. The person would want you to get on with life. I remember when my mom died very suddenly, and we were young when my mother died. I remember my father saying, you have to get on with life. I have a sister in the community, she's younger than I, who was entering the community the end of that August, and my mom died on August the 7th. And my dad said to her, I don't want to hear about you're not going. You have to get on with your life. I don't want to hear about that. That's not up for discussion. You do what you have to do. Your mom would want you to do that. Well, your friends, the sisters, they would want you to get on with your life too. So hanging on to a person, it's unrealistic. It's not going to bring them back. And you know what? I'm sorry to tell you, but they're much happier where they are now than they ever were with you. So let them go. You know, let it go. And the last thing I want to talk about is something called anticipatory grief. And anticipatory grief is when we're in the grieving process, and similar to yourselves, it keeps going on and on and on. We start to see the future as just another whole bombardment, if you will, of these deaths and losses. And so anticipatory grief is when you think you can't get beyond it. There's no way out. You just simply cannot get beyond it. And that causes quite a bit of problems among people because they're anticipating the worst, and it has the potential to be catching. So your anticipatory grief, without your really realizing it, is also spreading to somebody else. Anticipatory grief causes a lot of anxiety. Am I going to be next? Or who is going to be next? And you know, we all live under this foolish notion of control. The person who's next might be the person whom you least expect. So anticipatory grief causes that anxiety. The anxiety causes fear, and all of that is under the rubric of control. You don't have control over any of it. So anticipating what looks like could be the worst isn't going to, first of all, it's not going to prevent it from happening. And at an unconscious level, that's what anxiety is. It's, you know, you think the more anxious you are, the more you can prevent something from happening. It doesn't work like that. So being careful of anticipatory grief and not allowing yourself to get bombarded with that. Oh my goodness, I just lost my train of thought. A mind is a terrible thing to lose. Where was I going with that? Anticipatory grief. Well, it's not healthy. It doesn't help at all. I know where I was going. I was going to mindfulness. You know, I'm sure you've heard all about mindfulness. Mindfulness is a way of controlling, if you will, that anticipatory grief. Stay in the present moment. Stay where you are right now. Don't worry about the future. The birds of the air, the lilies of the field, don't worry about any of them. The sparrows that we read about in, was it yesterday or today? It's gospel. Don't worry about it. Stay in that present moment. This is where God is for you right now. Now, I know that I'm among the faithful here. Sometimes I use this when I'm giving talks and people look at me like, what are you talking about? You all remember blessing the hour, right? Of course, I knew I was in a Philadelphia group here. I've said, believe me, I would say 9/10 of the talks that I give to women religious across the country, they don't know what I'm talking about. And I say, well, didn't you ever say, let us remember the holy presence of God? No, totally blank. So that's mindfulness. The church didn't know that at the time. The good sisters who taught us, and you who taught my generation, well, no, I'm your generation now. I keep forgetting that. But the people who taught us, they didn't know that was mindfulness. But it was really very, very smart because it brings us back into the present moment. That present moment is where we need to be so we can avoid the anticipatory grief. So I'm going to stop there for this present moment and give you a minute to digest that. And then if you have any questions, contributions, disagreements, whatever, it doesn't matter. Julie's going to go around with the microphone so that you can express them. Or, you know, if you have an idea of something that I did not cover that has worked for you, please share it with everybody else in the group. So, any thoughts, sister?
Between 2021 and 2022, I lost my last 5 siblings.
Oh, my.
And I think that the one I know I miss the most because we talked all the time. I miss her for lots of reasons. First of all, I loved her dearly. And with this loss, I know I could have communicated to her and we could have talked about it. Both healed together, but I'm sort of on my own. And I've done well. I've done well. I think having the topic now with you, I can now feel the hole in my heart and the hurt. Having lost her most, you know, I loved all my siblings, but I was definitely close to her. But anyhow, I am moving along, and I thank God that they are a happier place, and I'll live with that happiness instead.
Thanks, sister.
Thank you.
Marcy, about 30 years ago, I lost my dear friend in community. It was a terrible loss for me. She had cancer. I knew the end was coming, but where there's life, there's always hope. My point in saying this is, I went to a grieving workshop. I don't remember if it was you or not.
Oh, wait a minute, Alice. 30 years ago, I was only 7 years old.
But I remember one thing this speaker said, and I'll never forget it. She said, you'll go on with your life. You'll go through your routine. I was a teacher. You'll go back and teach, which I did. And you'll adjust. But the key line that she said, and I'll never forget it, but life will never be the same.
That's right.
Is that a good thought to face?
Absolutely, absolutely. If it were the same, the person would not have meant that much to you. It's not the same. You know, there's always that empty spot. There's always that hole in your heart, of course. So, I mean, wouldn't it be awful if we never grieved over the people in our lives? I mean, what would that say about us? You know, if we never grieved, that we never allowed people to mean that much to us. Of course they do. Of course they do. So, no, that hole will always be there. Yep. Anybody else? Sister and sister? Or sister and sister?
Hearing your talk, I remember the time when my father died, and Miss Superior was very kind to me. She passed my room, and I was sobbing out loud, and she said, "Rose, don't you feel good?" I said, "No, for some reason or other, I'm missing my dad, our trips to town to get his tobacco and his shaving cream, and to stop at King Burger," which I didn't know he meant Burger King, to have lunch. And she said, "That is fine, just stay here. Don't worry about the rest of the day." And in about an hour or so, she came back. She said, "Come on, Rose, it's time for us to have some lunch." And she took me out in the kitchen, and nobody was around. And we just had lunch and started to laugh about things that I remembered about Dad. And it just meant a world to me that she took time out of her time to listen to me.
Right, right.
You know, and it really did help.
Yep. That spark, that presence. The spark doesn't have to be a big set of fireworks, just that presence. And interestingly, the things that you talked about that you missed with your dad, it wasn't Christmas, it wasn't Easter, it was those little moments, right, where you knew it was just you and Dad, and yeah, exactly, exactly. Sister?
I was taken by your remark, guilt is the greatest Irish export. I think a great number of us here have Irish roots, and I do think that that plays an important part in the way we live, the way we grieve, the way everything goes on. So I can't forget about that. And at this point, I'm forgetting what I was going to bring that into, but I guess that's part of the grieving, is that we have this propensity, I guess, for grieving.
Exactly. And give ourselves permission.
Yeah.
Right, right, exactly. Yeah, you know, I heard a priest say that one time, that guilt was the greatest Irish export. So I thought maybe we had the edge on it. But one day I had, you know, my faculty, a bunch of people who were not of Irish descent, and I came into the waiting room for my office one day, and this girl was from a totally Italian family, and I could hear her talking to her mother, and you know, her mother was a force to be reckoned with, which I actually didn't know that until this day. So she got off the phone, and I said, she didn't realize I had come into the office and there was a doorway between the two. And she went like this, and then she saw me. And she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, I shouldn't have." And I said, "What's the matter? What happened?" So she started to talk about her mother and how her mother was making her feel guilty for something. And I said, "I'm so relieved." And she said, "Why?" I said, "I thought we Irish were the only people who did that, and you're 100% Italian." Well, it helped her because it got her beyond it. And, you know, I mean, then I could share with her that, you know, guilt is pretty universal. Yeah. Anybody else?
I just have a comment. I've only been here since the end of February, and my entire career has been with the senior population. So unfortunately, death is not new to me. But what is new to me is when we lose a sister, it's a best friend, it's somebody you live with, it's somebody you work with, and it's not just in any normal facility, that person leaves and their family grieves and it's over. Here, it's just a heaviness all around us. And when I pass everybody in the hall and I say, "How are you doing?" I truly mean that, because we need to talk about it. And it's okay to say, "I'm sad, and it's a tough day, and you know, hopefully tomorrow will be better." The first week I started, I had a funeral, and the brother of the sister that passed, I went up and offered condolences, and he said, I'm not sad. She's waited her whole life to go to heaven and meet Jesus."
Wow.
And that was profound to me, because as a layperson, we don't wait our whole life to meet Jesus. We're living, and it just gave me such a different perspective on the community and how beautiful it is. And that has helped me throughout all of these funerals.
Yeah.
So I wanted to share.
There's a wonderful prayer that we use at our funerals that I wish now I had brought it with me, because I'm not going to do it justice, but it's a prayer from St. Bonaventure. And the prayer is, and we do it right at the closing of the coffin. That's where we say the prayer. "Let nothing of her life be lost, but let all in which she was good remain with us, so we can carry it on." So it's a beautiful prayer, and I think that's one of the things. Nothing in the whole communion of saints, nothing gets lost. Yeah. Anyone else? Well, thank you for your attention. I'm delighted to be here. I'm always delighted to be with you, so thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
God bless you.